imagine a country where a filmmaker is, like, expressly forbidden by law from showing a man and a woman touching on screen.
Right, or even, I mean, forbidden from criticizing the government or the economy, you know?
Exactly, or the state religion. They are operating under this massive censorship board that can ban a film for the slightest perceived infraction.
It could literally end a creator's career overnight.
Yeah, so you would expect the movies coming out of that environment to be just, well, terrible, right?
Oh, well,
You'd expect this really flat, rigid propaganda, like state-sanctioned brochures masquerading as movies.
Or any real, artistic nuances just completely crushed under this heavy ideology.
Right. But instead, those exact rules, those suffocating restrictions, they actually accidentally force the creation of some of the greatest cinematic masterpieces of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
It really is wild. It forces us to completely reevaluate the relationship between artistic innovation and political restriction. Because we're looking at an industry that just defied every logical expectation of how art is supposed to survive, let alone thrive, under that kind of immense regulatory pressure.
So true.
By stripping away the easiest tools of storytelling, the state inadvertently forced these filmmakers to develop an entirely new, incredibly sophisticated visual vocabulary.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. So whether you are a dedicated film student taking your very first steps into cinematic history, or you're just, a really curious learner wanting to understand how art actually functions in the real world.
This is going to change things for you.
Oh, it's going to fundamentally change the way you watch moving images. Today, we are diving into the astonishing, almost paradoxical phenomenon of Iranian cinema.
The central question here is really a mechanical one. How did an industry operating under some of the strictest regulatory mechanisms on the planet manage to break boundaries and achieve this massive global recognition?
Right, and to answer that, we're pulling from a really specific stack of academic sources today.
Yeah, we're looking at a comprehensive student primer called Maze to the Horizon, along with some guest lecture summaries, and a really detailed FAQ on the industry's evolution.
So our mission for this deep dive is to basically decode that unique visual language you mentioned. We're going to explore this dramatic, almost whiplash-inducing shift before and after the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
And then we'll look at how these films act as a mirror for the internal psychological struggles of the youth and how they document the shifting socio-political fabric of an entire nation.
But before we get into the actual mechanics, we need to lay down some ground rules.
Always important.
We are looking at this entirely impartially. The historical, religious, and political facts presented in our sources, those are just the context for the art.
Right. We're treating the cinema as a text that documents shifts in power and ideology.
Exactly. We aren't taking political sides here. We're simply observing how political gravity shapes artistic expression.
Which means we first have to establish how to actually read a cinematic text. Like for students just beginning to research this field, the foundational concept in our sources is that cinema is the seventh art.
The seventh art. I love that term.
Yeah, it's not just, recorded theater or a book on screen. It's an independent, unique language with its own specific syntactic elements.
Like what?
Like lighting, editing, sound design, camera placement, and crucially, off-screen space.
I think people, they often forget that film is never just a story. Like, you go to the theater, you get your popcorn, and you think you're just watching a narrative unfold.
Right, you're just watching the plot.
But the sources emphasize that the cinematic text is always operating on two distinct simultaneous levels.
Yes, the overt and the covert.
Exactly. So first you have the overt level. This is the visible plot.
Yeah.
The fictional characters, the dialogue, the car chase, the romance, it's the action you literally see happening on the screen.
It's the stuff in the trailer.
Yeah, the trailer stuff.
Okay.
But the overt level is really just a distraction.
It's the delivery mechanism.
Right. Because the real power of the medium is in the covert level.
And this is where it gets fascinating. The covert level is the hidden background, the social reality being depicted, and most importantly, the ideological meaning.
Right.
Cinema is a mass medium, so it represents the world ideologically. It actively and a lot of times subliminally shapes our perception of values.
I mean, every choice a director makes, where to put the camera, who is in focus, who's standing in the shadows, that's an ideological choice.
Exactly. It tells the audience who holds power, who is marginalized, and what's considered morally good or bad in that specific universe.
So let's visualize this. Think about watching a film like looking at this massive iceberg.
Okay, I like this.
So the overt plot, let's say it's just a simple family drama about a guy trying to find a job. That is just the tip of the iceberg sticking out of the water.
It's what catches your eye.
Right. It reflects the sun is what you think you're looking at. But the covert level, the underlying assumptions about class, the subtle critiques of economic policy, the expectations of masculinity, the religious undertones, that is the enormous, jagged structure hidden deep underwater.
And that hidden mass is what actually dictates how the iceberg moves, right? It gives it all its weight and momentum.
Exactly. And to take that analogy even further, the water itself is the mass culture surrounding the audience.
Yeah, our sources point out that for the viewer, especially if you're a film student, to truly grasp what's happening beneath the surface, you have to engage in this active process of decoding.
You can't just be a passive receiver.
Right, you have to be aware of the syntax. So if the camera holds on a wide shot of a man looking like incredibly small against a massive, brutalist concrete building, you aren't just seeing a guy walking to work.
Right, you're decoding a visual representation of the individual being crushed by state bureaucracy.
Exactly. And the sources make it very clear that Iranian filmmakers, because of the strict environment they were forced into, became absolute masterclass experts at this covert level.
So let's put our decoder rings on, and travel back in time. Let's see what the cinematic landscape actually looked like before the country's whole foundation shifted.
We're talking about the 1960s and 1970s, the pre-revolution era under the Shah.
Right. And what's immediately obvious from the text is how vastly different the cinema was back then compared to the international festival darlings we associate with Iran today.
Oh, it was like night and day. The cinema back then was wildly popular, but its audience demographic was really specific.
Yeah, it was mostly consumed by the lower classes, the working class, and the general public in these rapidly growing urban centers.
And the narrative focus, the overt level of that iceberg was built almost entirely on optimism, escape, and just high-octane fantasy.
Which makes sense when you look at the context.
Yeah.
Our sources paint this picture of a nation going through really intense, rapid modernization.
You had massive migrations of people leaving rural villages and pouring into expanding cities.
Right, which creates this profound sense of economic and social uncertainty. People were, they were unsure of where the country was heading.
And they were dealing with a really harsh, grueling daily reality. So cinema became this vital pressure release valve.
A 2-hour escape from the factory line or urban poverty.
Exactly. And the themes were so melodramatic. The sources detail these really specific tropes. You had endless films dealing with the tension between city dwellers and villagers.
Which literally mirrored what was happening on the streets.
Yeah. And then you had stories steeped in traditional Iranian mythology and folklore, like these exaggerated tales of madness versus sanity.
I read about the false accusation plots, too.
Oh, yeah. Highly emotional plots about false accusations of murder and then sweeping narratives of compassion, forbidden love, and these big heroic rescues.
Okay, but let's pause and look at the covert level here. Because if an entire nation's cinematic output is hyper-focused on escapism and mythical rescues, doesn't that tell a very specific kind of dark story about the psychology of the audience?
How do you mean?
Well, if you constantly need to escape your reality through movies where some mythical hero swoops in to save the day, doesn't that desperate need for escape actually highlight how powerless the working class felt? Like, isn't that a glaring symptom of a society in deep, deep distress?
That is exactly the critical reading our sources encourage.
Really?
Yeah. The overt level is this dazzling fantasy, right? But the covert level reveals a society that feels deeply disenfranchised.
Wow.
The popularity of these narratives where the little guy is falsely accused but finally gets vindicated by a hero, it points to a profound collective anxiety about justice and power.
Because they couldn't find justice or economic stability in real life.
Exactly. So they bought a ticket to see it simulated on a screen. That on-screen optimism was basically a psychological band-aid over a festering socioeconomic wound caused by wealth inequality and these disorienting cultural shifts.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
But as we know from history, that wound eventually ruptured.
It did. January 1979.
Right, the Islamic Revolution sweeps across the country, and that entire era of cinematic escapism, the melodramas, the heroes,
Yeah.
it just comes to a violent, sudden halt.
The sociocultural and political upheaval was absolute. I mean, initially, The revolution actually endangered the local film industry.
Actively harmed it. Yeah.
Yeah. The sources talk about how production chains were broken, theaters were literally burned down because they were viewed as symbols of Western corruption.
Artistic freedom was completely restricted, and the industry essentially just ground to a halt.
The new establishment viewed cinema with extreme suspicion. The Islamists and the revolutionary reformists looked at the existing industry and saw a purely Western tool.
They saw promoting moral decay.
Right. Consumerism, secularism, improper social behaviors. There was a very real push at the beginning to just dismantle the whole thing, erase it.
But then, and this is where the story gets really interesting, there's this massive, highly strategic pivot.
Yes. The state leadership realizes that destroying the infrastructure would actually be a huge mistake.
Because they recognize the pedagogical potential of the medium. Like, you can reach millions of people across vast geographic and class divides, all at exactly the same time.
So instead of destroying the apparatus, they systematically transformed it into a highly regulated, state-controlled tool.
It's like taming a wild horse.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, think about it. The state looks at cinema, this wild, unpredictable beast that's been running free, spreading Western ideals and escapist fantasies, and at first, they want to put it down.
Shoot the horse.
Exactly. But then they realize, wait, if we put a heavy, restrictive saddle on this horse, and we put thick blinders on it so it could only look exactly where we want it to look.
It's the fastest vehicle to carry their new ideological message.
Exactly. You don't kill the horse, you harness its momentum.
And harnessing that momentum resulted in a complete Islamization of culture, which fundamentally altered how cinema functioned.
Right, the new rules.
The state created this incredibly strict code for production, and this code dictated everything. What could be shown, how men and women could interact, how women had to be dressed on screen.
What moral messages a film was even allowed to have.
Exactly. But, and this is the crucial part for understanding how the industry survived, the state didn't just censor, they funded.
Ah, the money.
Yes. They established economic institutions to subsidize film production. They turned local cinema and television into powerful, well-funded players whose explicit purpose was to work toward the revolution's goals.
So if you played by their rules, you had the backing of the state.
You got the budget.
But imagine being a filmmaker in that environment. You want to make art, you want to tell stories about the human condition,
Right.
But you're trapped in this heavy saddle.
It's incredibly restrictive.
You're operating under a board that evaluates every single frame. You can't talk about politics, you can't show physical intimacy, you can't critique the economy.
You're bound by a rigid moral code.
Right. So how do you survive as an artist? What do you actually do?
You turn the camera inward.
Inward.
Yeah. Because overt external political critique was entirely off limits, creators turned their lenses toward the internal landscape.
The mind.
Exactly. They focus deeply, almost exclusively, on the psychological processes of their characters and on universal moral dilemmas. This is a massive tectonic shift in the artistic language of Iranian cinema.
So they basically took the dramatic conflict off the streets and out of the political arena and placed it entirely inside the human soul.
Exactly. Our sources highlight this newly mandated narrative structure, the struggle between urges and morals.
The urge versus the moral.
Right. The narrative deliberately brought conscience and complex human emotion to the forefront, and the hero of the story changed completely.
No more mythical rescuers.
Exactly. The good protagonist, the new, state-approved hero, was a deeply flawed, ordinary person battling their own internal drive.
Like selfish urges or material desires.
Yeah, and ultimately achieving this hard-won moral victory that perfectly aligned with the new societal expectations.
And the texts emphasize that this was heavily targeted at the youth.
Right. Oh, absolutely. The cinema was actively deployed to shape the cultural and moral values of young consumers. It was meant to be a model for imitation.
So a young person watches a movie, sees a protagonist tempted to do the wrong thing, maybe steal or lie for personal gain, and watches them agonize over it before making the righteous choice.
It leaves them with a profound moral message about how a proper society functions.
Okay, but wait. I have to challenge the actual efficacy of this strategy.
Go for it.
Because we're talking about the mechanics of the cinematic apparatus here. Cinema is inherently visual, right? It's inherently voyeuristic. It naturally draws our attention to conflict and transgression. So, if a filmmaker's entire movie is focused on a protagonist struggling intensely against a forbidden urge, doesn't the camera inherently glamorize the urge just by paying so much attention to it?
That is a great question.
Like, if you spend 85 minutes visually exploring how incredibly tempting it is to resist a sin and only 5 minutes visualizing the moral victory at the end, doesn't the audience walk away remembering the temptation?
You're touching on the eternal tightrope walk of subversive filmmaking.
Aren't they inadvertently advertising the behaviors they want to suppress?
Well, yes and no, and this is a testament to the absolute brilliance of these Iranian directors. They understood exactly what you just pointed out.
They knew what they were doing.
Oh, totally. To make the state-mandated moral victory at the end feel earned, the internal struggle leading up to it had to be authentic.
The temptation had to feel real.
Right. And in the process of making that psychological struggle authentic, the filmmakers were able to smuggle in profound human realism. They were technically fulfilling the state's requirement for a moralistic conclusion, but they were spending the entire runtime exploring the very real, very complex human desires and societal flaws that the state was trying to pretend didn't exist.
So the overt level is the moral victory, but the covert level is this deep empathy for human frailty.
Precisely. It's subversion from within the rules, and they achieved this through pacing.
Pacing.
Yeah, they utilized incredibly long takes. They allowed the camera to just linger on the face of an actor lost in thought.
By stretching out time, they forced the audience to sit with the psychological weight of the dilemma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The conflict wasn't expressed in dialogue, which could easily be censored. It was expressed in the silence, in micro-expressions, in the physical isolation of a character within the frame.
That is a brilliant survival tactic. But this aesthetic of internal morality and psychological realism was about to be forged in the fires of a profound, devastating national tragedy. A tragedy that fundamentally altered the artistic language of these films yet again. It pushed them out of pure interiority and back out into the physical world.
Right. We're moving into the late 1980s and the 1990s now, and the sources point to two major factors that shifted the cinematic landscape.
What was the first?
The first was a slight, very cautious softening of the extreme ideological controls following the death of Ayatollah Khomeini.
It allowed for just a fraction more breathing room.
Right. But the second, and arguably the most impactful factor, was the aftermath of the incredibly bloody Iran-Iraq war under Saddam Hussein.
That war lasted 8 years. It was a generational trauma that touched almost every single family in the country. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, cities decimated.
And according to the texts, this immense collective trauma is where the cinema truly steps up as an agent of history.
It evolves beyond just a pedagogical tool for morality. It becomes a vital tool for collective memory.
Exactly. The sheer scale of the trauma-led creators to take a new, unflinching look at their local environment. They definitively abandon any lingering traces of pre-revolution fantasy.
Right, there's no room for escapism when your city has been bombed.
Exactly. The cinematic language cemented itself in highly critical social realism. The filmmakers began to critically reconstruct the collective memory of the Iranian people.
They were documenting the political and social changes, the devastation of the war, the economic hardship, but doing it from a deeply humanistic, grassroots perspective.
They weren't making grand, patriotic war epics filled with explosions and generals.
Right, they were looking at the scars left on everyday people. They were filming the rubble, the orphans, the widows trying to navigate a bureaucracy that had completely forgotten them.
And in doing so, they created a paradox that we see so often in the history of art.
Which is?
It's often out of the most severe collective trauma combined with the absolute strictest regulatory constraints that a society produces its most profound, authentic, artistic voice.
It's almost as if the cinema became a form of national therapy.
That's a great way to put it.
The trauma was too massive, and the political situation was still too sensitive to discuss overtly or aggressively. So the filmmakers helped the nation process it through these quiet, everyday struggles of ordinary people on screen.
The camera became a witness to resilience.
And it was exactly this new, trauma-forged voice, this highly nuanced social realism born out of severe restriction that suddenly caught the attention of the outside world.
Yes. This brings us to what the global film community calls the Iranian breakthrough.
The breakthrough. The sources describe this as a literal shock to the international film industry.
It really was. In the 1990s, the Cannes Film Festival in France, arguably the most prestigious platform for cinema in the world, began shining this massive spotlight on Iranian films.
Suddenly, international distributors wanted to buy them. Critics were writing endless essays. The global cinema landscape, which was dominated by Hollywood blockbusters and slick European art house films, was just transfixed by these quiet, low-budget films from Tehran.
Which begs a really vital question, especially when we consider how isolated Iran was politically at the time.
Why did the world care?
Exactly. What did Iranian cinema bring to the table that Hollywood or the French industry didn't already have?
And the sources argue it was this completely unique artistic language these creators had developed. They achieved an incredible symbiosis of artistic creativity and sharp social critique.
Relying on a deeply rich, highly specific visual vocabulary.
So let's really break down that visual vocabulary, especially for the film students listening to this deep dive.
Okay, so the texts compare the aesthetic uniqueness of Iranian cinema during this time to massive historic movements like Italian neorealism of the 1940s and the French New Wave of the 1960s.
Those were also movements born out of post-war traumas, right, and rejections of the glossy studio system.
Exactly. They rejected artificial spectacles, they favored stark realism, they used non-professional actors to capture unpolished truth, and they shot on real streets instead of sound stages.
They focused on the mundane struggles of the working class and utilized profound visual symbolism rather than expositional dialogue.
And Iranian cinema adopted these techniques but mutated them to survive their specific censorship.
Because of the strict state code, they couldn't rely on overt dialogue to express dissent.
Right. You couldn't have a character give a grand speech about poverty. They had to speak visually.
So if you can't have characters openly criticize the failing economy, how do you show it?
You dedicate a long, unbroken tracking shot to following a child walking down a rocky street, and you focus the camera entirely on the worn-out, flapping soles of their shoes.
Oh, wow.
The worn-out shoe becomes the covert ideological text. It communicates economic disparity and neglect, the struggle of the next generation, all without uttering a single banned word.
That is so powerful.
Yeah.
And the mechanics of how they handle intimacy and relationships are equally fascinating.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
Because if the censors dictate that a husband and wife or a man and a woman who aren't married cannot physically touch on screen, they can't even be alone in a closed room together, how do you visually communicate love or tension?
You use off-screen space, sound design, and the geometry of the frame.
Give us an example of how that geometry works.
Okay. Imagine a scene where two characters are having a deeply emotional conversation, but they're forbidden from touching or looking at each other directly in a way the censors might deem inappropriate.
Right.
The director might place one character in the deep background of the frame, completely out of focus, and the other character in extreme close-up in the foreground.
So they speak without really looking at each other.
Exactly. The physical distance between them in the frame becomes a visual metaphor for their emotional alienation, or the societal barriers keeping them apart.
That's brilliant.
Or consider the use of off-screen space. A woman is sitting in a room, we hear a door open off-screen, we hear the specific rhythm of footsteps.
You don't see the person.
You don't see them. The lighting in the room subtly shifts as a shadow falls across her. And the camera simply holds on her face, capturing a micro-expression, a softening of the eyes, a slight tension in the jaw.
So the intimacy isn't in a physical kiss. It's constructed entirely through the manipulation of time, ambient sound, and the audience's projection of emotion onto that space.
Yes.
It's like poetry. In fact, it's exactly like a specific kind of poetry. Because they couldn't speak freely, they were forced to communicate in metaphors. It's like a poet who is suddenly restricted by law to only writing in haiku.
That is a fantastic comparison.
Like the strict limitation of syllables, the 5-7-5 structure doesn't destroy the poetry. On the contrary, it forces the poet to choose every single word with agonizing precision.
It eliminates all the fluff.
Right. It forces you to rely on metaphor. The limitation actually creates a more beautiful, dense, and universally understood language. They took the heavy blinders the state put on them, and they turned those blinders into a framing device to compose masterpieces.
That is the perfect distillation of their method. Symbolism became their primary syntax.
A mirror reflecting a fractured image.
An empty chair, a winding, dusty road leading to nowhere, a child's lost notebook. These everyday objects were loaded with immense emotional and political weight.
Because human emotion, the struggle for dignity, and visual metaphor are universal languages, these films transcended their highly specific local context.
Exactly. A viewer in Japan or France or the United States, they didn't need to understand the intricacies of Iranian municipal law to understand the grief and humanity on screen.
The very mechanics they used to evade local censors made their art globally resonant.
But as always happens in the history of art, global recognition brings global influence.
And global influence leads to an entirely new set of challenges in the modern era. We've traced the journey from commercial escapism to internal psychological struggle, through the trauma of war to the global breakthrough. So what does Iranian cinema look like today as it navigates the overwhelming force of globalization?
The sources indicate that modern films have fundamentally changed the battlefield. They now routinely cross national borders politically, economically, and thematically.
They aren't operating in a closed ecosystem anymore.
Not at all. They are actively engaging with Western influences, the pressures of globalization, digital communication, and consumer capitalism.
And the primary thematic lens through which they navigate this complex new world is the concept of identity.
Identity is the master key for understanding the modern era of this cinema. The texts detail a profound, incredibly volatile tension playing out on screen.
A push and pull.
Yes. On one side, you have the forces of globalization. Globalization inherently encourages consumer culture, rapid modernization, and most importantly, individualism.
It tells the youth that their personal desires and personal identity supersede the collective.
Which directly forcefully challenges traditional, collective society, which prioritizes familial duty, religious adherence, and communal harmony.
It creates a massive cultural tug-of-war, and the cinema is the mirror reflecting it.
Exactly. On one hand, the films document the fostering of unique individual identities. You see characters grappling with modern ambitions, wanting to leave the country, pursuing secular careers, navigating modern relationships.
But on the other hand, this rapid modernization triggers intense resistance movements.
The films document how this individualism fuels pushback from conservative factions who view this creeping Western influence as an existential threat to the soul of the nation.
So the heroes of these modern films are no longer just battling their internal moral urges in a vacuum, like they were in the 1980s.
The struggle has been externalized again. They are battling their individual desires against the crush of globalization on one side and the heavy weight of traditional societal expectations on the other.
It's a full-blown crisis of modern identity.
It really is. And the sources point out a fascinating visual evolution regarding how traditional values and local mythology are handled now.
They are just discarded, right?
No, not at all. Modern films often weave those ancient traditional values and local myths directly back into these contemporary urban settings.
Oh, that's interesting. Give me an example.
So you might have a story about a modern couple arguing about a divorce in a high-rise apartment, but the thematic undertones and the visual framing echo ancient Persian tragedies or moral parables.
It creates this complex, layered dialogue between the ancient and the modern. It makes the decoding process even richer for the audience.
And we must highlight how this modern clash of ideologies is visualized specifically through the characters of women.
Yes, the sources note the changing visual presentation of ideology through female characters. On screen, women are often positioned at the very epicenter of this cultural clash.
How a female character navigates the public versus private sphere, how she manages the state-mandated dress code.
Like letting a scarf slip slightly in a private moment, or wearing a brighter color in a sea of dark coats.
Exactly. These subtle visual cues are massive, covert ideological texts. The female characters essentially wear the ideology of the era.
Their actions on screen reflect this shifting, heavily contested social and political status of women in the real world.
It's brilliant visual storytelling.
But I have to challenge this modern era a bit, specifically regarding the international success.
Okay, let's hear it.
As Iranian cinema gains more international funding, as it gets co-produced by European studios, and as filmmakers explicitly aim for prestigious global festivals like Cannes or Venice, is there a danger that the art form loses its soul?
Ah, the festival dilemma.
Yeah. Is there a risk that it stops reflecting the authentic, everyday Iranian experience? What happens when a filmmaker realizes that Western juries love films about Iranian suffering?
That's a very real concern highlighted in our texts.
Is there a danger that they start producing what Western audiences expect an Iranian film to look like? Essentially, are they at risk of playing to a stereotype of exotic trauma just to win awards and secure European funding?
You've identified the quintessential trap of globalization in art. When a national cinema becomes a darling of the international festival circuit, the economic incentives drastically shift.
The audience changes.
Exactly. A director isn't just making a film for the working class in Tehran anymore, hoping to spark a local conversation. They are, consciously or subconsciously, making a film for a jury in France or a distribution company in New York.
Maintaining that truly authentic voice, the incredibly delicate voice born from strict local censorship while playing on a global, capitalist stage.
Yeah.
That has to be incredibly hard.
It is perhaps the greatest and most dangerous challenge modern Iranian creators face today. The pressure to self-exoticize is immense.
It's a fascinating paradox to end on. The very success and global recognition born from their brilliantly unique visual language could be the exact mechanism that ultimately dilutes it.
It's a tightrope walk.
So let's recap this incredible journey. We started with the foundational concept that cinema is a language of overt plots and covert ideologies.
The iceberg.
The iceberg. We saw how the pre-revolution era used escapist myths and high melodrama as a psychological release valve for a struggling lower class.
Then came 1979, the near destruction of the industry, followed by its rebirth as a heavily regulated state-funded pedagogical tool.
But the filmmakers, trapped within these strict religious moral codes, survived by turning the camera inward. They focused on the psychological interiority of the youth, charting the battle between human urges and state-mandated morals.
And then, through the collective devastating trauma of the Iran-Iraq War and the continuous strictures of censorship, they abandoned escapism entirely.
They embraced a highly critical, deeply humanistic social realism.
They became the agents of collective memory. Forced to bypass literal dialogue, they developed a uniquely brilliant, metaphor-rich visual language.
A true symbiosis of art, poetry, and social critique that shocked the world and conquered the global festival circuit. Which brings us to today, where those films now document the intense clash between individual identity, Western globalization, and traditional religious society.
It's a testament to the resilience of art.
It really is. So the next time you sit down to watch a film, whether it is an acclaimed Iranian masterpiece, a quiet European indie, or the loudest, most expensive Hollywood blockbuster home watcher, I want you to remember the lesson of these filmmakers.
Remember the iceberg?
Remember the iceberg. You are never, ever just watching a story unfold. You are actively decoding a historical document. You are looking at a reflection of societal trauma. You are reading the shifting status of class and power, and you're witnessing a battlefield of ideological values playing out right in front of your eyes in 24 frames per second.
Beautifully said.
Which leaves us with one final, lingering question to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. We have seen today how immense regulatory constraints, state censorship, and severe limitations inadvertently forced Iranian filmmakers to be brilliant.
It forced them to invent a poetic visual language just to survive as artists.
The friction created the spark. So if one day all of those constraints were completely removed, if the state stepped back and gave filmmakers absolute, unfiltered, well-funded freedom to show and say whatever they wanted,
would Iranian cinema soar to even greater, unimaginable artistic heights?
Or would it lose the very friction, the very pressure that produced its greatest masterpieces? We'll leave you to decode that one for yourself.